a little, I can get in there.
Okay.
Okay. So tell me who you are and what your expertise is.
My name is Jerry Brunetti. I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania. I run a small agro-consulting company called Agri-Dynamics. My expertise is surrounded with livestock nutrition, agronomy, and horticulture. I deal with livestock farmers who are engaged in ecological practices like grazing. I also deal with horticultural producers that are involved with organics, as well as what we call transitional agriculture. And I also deal with making animal remedies that replace pharmaceutical drugs for those livestock people that are trying to get away from the use of pharmaceutical drugs for livestock production.
Very comprehensive. So how did you hear about this Agricultural Design Conference here on Maui?
Actually, I was invited here by Vince Mina. And the reason Vince invited me is because I've been a previous speaker at the Aloha Aina Maui, the Maui Aloha Aina conferences that he's had in the fall or in the winter months, and I've been a speaker there, probably a handful of times, and so Vince asked me if I could bring some of my insight to this design conference.
How did you first meet Vincent Mina?
Vince and I met approximately a decade ago, I think it was, at an Acres USA conference in the Midwest, which is Acres USA is an ecological publication. It's been around for 3 decades, and they have a annual winter conference. And I was a speaker there, and Vince was an attendee there, and we met on the elevator and became friends and collaborators since.
The rest is history, huh?
The rest is history, yeah.
Okay. So, how do you feel that the conference has been going?
It's very interesting to me. It's something that's stirring the pot relative to the needs that I have in my own community. We all have the same issues in terms of sustainability concerns, regenerating the communities, regenerating the landscapes, regenerating the economy. Every community seems to be suffering from this. I just came back to the States from Australia. I was over there for a conference, not too dissimilar from this one. We didn't have a lot of hands-on details. It was mostly speakers that were raising questions that could inspire, that could educate, and that could challenge the listeners, like the process here is bringing out in folks. So I found out that the details that are going on here kind of reflected what was going on in Down Under. And I think it's important that people have been able to dial into what it is that they envision as being an optimal community, and more importantly, or just as importantly, how to implement those visions. So I think it's going to be something that's going to be lasting, and I think it's probably the most viable thing probably your island has ever embraced relative to dealing with this very comprehensive issue of sustainability.
Terrific. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that means? Compare it to Pennsylvania, to Maui. When you say it's important to this community that this conference is happening, how does it relate or compare to your experience on the mainland or someplace else? Is Maui unique? Is it small town kind of atmosphere different from what
Maui, how it compares to Pennsylvania or other communities like in the East Coast, similarities and differences. Big differences based on the Aloha sort of mindset that's here. You have a still intact native cultural impetus here. And that's kind of interesting and unique. That's not necessarily as obvious in other communities, even though we have obviously native populations in the East Coast, but not like the Aloha communities do. So those are the dissimilarities, I guess you would say they are. And the similarities are that we're importing most of our food, into Pennsylvania like you are here. The same is true with energy. We're an energy-rich country, or county, or I should say state. We have a lot of coal. And that's not an energy we want to be depending on. We have recently discovered a lot of natural gas, which they're drilling for. So these are things that, caused me a great deal of anxiety because we also have the second largest amount of rivers and streams following Alaska. And so to me, one of the sustainable energy resources that we should be tapping with micro hydro, in my opinion, is water. And we're not. You know, we're going after the fossil fuels yet because they're there in abundance and big companies have a lot of clout. Relative to the food issues, in Pennsylvania, we still do have a fair number of what we would call smallholders. We have a decentralized farming community, somewhat in the sense that a lot of the farm sizes are not huge. We don't have the landscape to accommodate massive farms, so we have a lot of plain people there, Amish and Mennonite folks that are in that state. And so we have the opportunity to take a very decentralized smallholder, owner, operator, farming community and integrate it with our urban communities. We're also very urban. We have Philadelphia and we have Pittsburgh. The state of Pennsylvania is 12 million, but it also happens to be, curiously or paradoxically enough, the most rural state in the United States in terms of the numbers of decentralized villages and small towns. So we have a great opportunity to kind of integrate the rural landscape with the urban landscape there. So that's a challenge and also an opportunity, as we're talking about challenge and opportunity at this design conference. We're big on livestock where you're not, so we're very different from you that way. We obviously don't have the growing season you have here, so we don't have the fruits and vegetable opportunities that you have here. We produce a lot of dairy. We're 5th in the United States for dairy. And that's starting to really take off relative to the raw milk impetus. We have a very strong raw milk initiative in Pennsylvania and getting stronger all the time. So there's a lot of things like artisan cheeses and yogurts and those kinds of things being produced. We have crops that produce cereals, which you don't have here. So we produce a lot of not just maize or corn, but we produce wheat, barley, oats, which is something I think you guys need to be looking at to create a granary here for feed mills, for pastured poultry, pastured pork, maybe some dairy needs, and also bakeries. You need a granary for your bakeries here. So yeah, the similarities, differences, common issues, for sure.
Tell me how the farmers where you live would benefit from renewable energy sources. So like you were talking about the stream sources for micro hydro and stuff like that. Is that something that you're involved in as a farmer or representative speaking to farmers? Are you trying to coordinate energy use as well as farm practices and animal husbandry and that sort of thing?
Not directly. I'm not involved directly with energy implications or applications for farm clientele. We have nearby where I live the Middle Atlantic Alternative Energy Festival every year in a small town called Kempton, Pennsylvania. I think we're all going on our 5th year there. And there's a lot of interest in alternative energy. So solar's picking up, wind is picking up where it's appropriate, and things like biodiesel and such are picking up. What I think there's a real need for it because agriculture can be pretty energy intensive. I mean, particularly if you're processing. So if you're making cheeses and you're refrigerating dairy products or you're doing a community kitchen or whatever, processing the food takes energy. So it would be great to see, you know, a whole nother venue of, you know, of an alternative industry that deals with alternative energies. But I'm personally not involved with it. Now the board that I sit on the board of directors for the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. The acronym for that is PASA, pasafarming.org. And every year they have a conference in February, and we include as many possibilities in that conference that people need to have access to, including farming of all persuasions, whether it's fruit, nut, berry, vegetables, dairy, beef, small ruminants, forestry, and alternative energy, of course, is included in that venue relative to people wanting to learn how they can become more energy self-sufficient.
Are you in touch with a lot of value-added processors in your area? I mean, you mentioned...
I'm involved with the value-added processing more through the PASA organization, because that's one of the big things that PASA really is focused on. There is a subset of PASA that was developed called the Good Food Neighborhood, which is all about creating a huge interest with the other side of the farming sector, which is the consuming sector, the patrons, the customers. So that includes not only the stores and the farmers markets and the community-supported agricultural folks, but also the restaurants. You know, trying to look at food banks and every way we can possibly create an opportunity through the Good Food Neighborhood. You know, we're opening up those venues for both sides of the fence, the producers and the patrons.
What sort of techniques do you employ to get the consumers and producers, you know, sort of meeting each other, like consumer?
Some of the ways that we get the consumers and the producers together. For example, I also sit on the board for the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is a nutritional foundation. It's headquartered out of D.C., but it's an international organization. We have a local chapter in many states. I'm on the steering committee of the local chapter. And since we tend to emphasize the discussion about food being medicine, we have quarterly meetings where we bring in a speaker that discusses health issues holistically and how they relate to dietary influences. And so we bring in speakers that talk about the food as medicine talk. And we also invite all the farmers that produce these kinds of foods, whether it's vegetables and fruits, whether it's dairy products, whether it's pastured chicken, whether it's jerky, honey. And so they're around the whole room. And what we do is we connect through email and through slow mail people that are members of the Weston A. Price Foundation with those producers, so that we have a connection there. So that's one thing that we do. PASA also does similar things. They have events like dinners. They'll have like the harvest dinner. They'll have a grass-fed beef cook-off with judges from restaurants that evaluate, you know, who's got the best tasting grass-fed beef. And so these are public events that invite the public to this wonderful buffet of all kinds of local foods. The chefs get involved because they're interested in the best quality of foods, because it obviously is a reflection of their art of cooking that food. So hotels participate, microbreweries participate. We have an event in southeastern Pennsylvania called Bike Fresh, Bike Local. So it's a biking event where people can bike a few miles, or they can go 20-some miles. It ends up at a microbrewery with local foods and locally produced microbrewed beer. So there's just a few examples of some of the things we're doing in Pennsylvania.
Great. So what's your background in agriculture?
I didn't grow up as a kid on a farm. I worked on some farms, and I ended up becoming an ag science major, animal science major back in the late 60s. And from being an animal science major, I ended up going to cow-calf operation in Western Virginia. Did that until a partnership didn't work out. Ended up back in Pennsylvania. Ended up becoming employed by the National Farmers Organization, working in a cooperative fashion in the dairy livestock sector. One of my duties was supervising quality control of milk. I did that for a handful of years, and then I started a consultancy in 1979 that dealt with trying to improve the bottom line of my clients, of which I had about 50 some odd clients. And the way we improved the bottom line, because there was no buy fresh, buy local, there was no certified organic, there was no PASA, there was none of these resources. All there was basically selling to the conventional outlets. And so the only thing we had access over economically was how do we improve profitability by reducing costs. And we did that by doing an audit of what are our yield limiting factors on that farm, and only appropriating funds for those things that were necessary and not appropriating funds for things that were unnecessary. So we oftentimes increased yields, at the very least held the yields the same, while dramatically cutting the cost of producing those yields, whether it was milk, whether it was corn, whether it was alfalfa, whether it was soybeans, wheat, whatever. We could always improve the bottom line by looking at only applying those things that were requisite for optimum production without purchasing unnecessary inputs.
Where do you think your passion for food and agriculture came from? It sounds like you know, you certainly.
Well, that's a good question, and I have to say honestly, I'd say it was probably my Italian American culture.
My passion for came
from my passion for my food came from growing up in the Italian American culture. I was probably the last generation to still have one foot in the old world. I was born here, was raised in America, but all my grandparents came from Italy, and so the food cultural connection was very profound. And so many things that had to do with the culture was centered around the food, centered around the table. So food was, you know, a vital component of my culture growing up. And I think that it started there. Everybody in the small towns, the immigrants that came over here and lived in small towns, a lot of them came from farms in the old world and never stopped. And when they came over here, even if they lived in town, there was no yard. You know, the yard was completely turned into vegetable and fruit production, pigs, chickens, whatever they could do, and plus everybody hunted and fished. So food was always a part of survival, but it was mostly a part of the glue of the culture. So I think that's where I got it, the infection from, of food and I always loved being in the outdoors. So what a better combination to be in the outdoors and to eat well. You know, that's the agrarian experience, to be a well-fed naturalist. So.
I love it, a well-fed naturalist. So what can you tell me about working with, you know, the disparate cultural populations like the Mennonites and that sort of thing in Pennsylvania that are sort of unique and have their own cultural traditions of farm practice and that sort of thing? Are they receptive to more modern ideas, and is there resistance to making changes that would benefit them? Or
that's a good question. The Mennonite and Amish community, you know, also followed the misdirection of the Green Revolution. You know, a lot of purchased inputs, a lot of toxic inputs, not nearly the amount that the conventional non-plain community purchased. Nevertheless, you know, they had a lot of issues with using a lot of salt fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, and all the sides. And over time, what occurred in those communities, and this was told to me by some elders in the Amish community in Ohio, in Holmes County, Ohio, which is one of the largest Amish populated counties in the United States, was that once upon a time, not that many years ago, 90% of the youth ended up in agriculture, and today it's only 10%. And the reason for that is because the cost of getting in agriculture is pretty substantial in terms of purchasing land, purchasing livestock, purchasing everything. Whereas the cost of getting into the trades, which they're often involved with, is a $5 lunch bucket. And so what's happened is a lot of the Amish population got into a very lucrative trade business. They're noted for being very crafty at constructing everything from fences to barns to houses. And so there's been a big demand, particularly during the housing bubble, to recruit these people because they're affordable and they have a good work ethic and they have good craftsmanship. But that bubble has now collapsed. And so now there's a reevaluation of saying where should we have spent our energy in terms of educating our youth? And I think people are revisiting the agrarian ethic as to where their communities are going to be best placed, and the viability of those communities and the sustainability and longevity of those communities is best placed with a land ethic. That being said, they also realize they're good entrepreneurs, these people. They know that it's a good idea to interface with the non-plain community that wants to buy their merchandise. And in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, you know, the tourists bring billions of dollars to Amish communities. And so the Amish take advantage of that, not with so much their agricultural stuff, because they're selling that mostly wholesale. They take advantage of that with quilts and farm stands and shoe fly pies and wooden furniture and crafts and things like that. So they're not afraid of interfacing with the non-Amish community. But they also know that the real interest is artisan foods. And so there's a resurgence with the Amish community to recognize that there's a massive demand, a massive appetite and interest in the urban and suburban communities to purchase foods that you can't get in the grocery store unless you pay a very high premium because they come in from Europe or someplace. So yeah, it's catching on, and they realize they've got to do it in an ecological fashion, and they're interested in that. They know that ecological farming is economical farming. They know that ecological farming is value-added farming because that's a label. And they know that ecological farming is also safety for their families in terms of not being exposed to substances that can cause cancer and genetic defects.
When you say artisan foods, in their area, that's one group of products. Can you compare what that represents to what we might develop here on Maui?
Well, again, some similarities. Again, you don't have a dairy industry here, and I think it would be a massive success here. Everybody consumes yogurt, ice cream, cheeses, whole milks would be great, but I mean the value-added dairy products would be fantastic here. You have a pasturing season, and I'm talking grass-fed. No grain coming in from the mainland, everything produced here. So you could have a grass-based, very profitable, economically based dairy industry here. We're doing it in the States. You could do it better than we're doing it on the mainland because you've got a 12-month growing season if you do it right. So I think the granaries would work. I know once upon a time, from what I understand, there were some cereals that were produced here like wheat, and I would imagine that some of these cereals could be brought back, grown correctly, and those cereals could be converted into feed for pastured poultry, pastured pork, and bakeries to make artisan breads. Because you don't have any artisan bread bakeries here either, and you don't have any feed mills here. But chickens, everybody loves eggs. People love pastured poultry, pastured turkey, pastured duck, and so you need some grain for those pastured animals. With ruminants like cows, you don't need any grain if you do it right. You could have you do have a beef industry here, but it could be done in a way that is a lot more efficient using the MOB model, which is the wild model that's been replicated out of Africa through Alan Savory's work called Holistic Management International, where they're looking at how wild animals graze, and it's basically the predator-prey arrangement or relationship where the predators mob the herding animals so they're constantly moving. So there's intensive pressure and interfacing on the ground, but for a very, very short period of time and a long period of rest afterwards, which really increases the organic matter and fertility of the soil. So you've got that. There's, obviously you've got plenty of fruits and plenty of vegetables, but cultured foods would be another one. Taking some of those vegetables and fermenting them into things like kimchis and sauerkrauts and fermented fruits and vegetables, all kinds of value added there. I see a real opportunity for fermented vegetables besides beer. Microbreweries are actually a big part of the slow food movement, indirectly or directly, but the kombuchas and the various kinds of sodas, the fermented sodas that come from fermenting your fruits and roots, that's being done on the mainland, at least in my area, on a small scale, but very successfully by those entrepreneurs. So I think the sky's the limit. Sky's the limit in terms of what you could do here, and that currently isn't being done. It's a fantastic opportunity. You've got all these tourists that would probably prefer to eat artisan foods that are grown by locals that don't cost them any more than all the food that's being shipped in from the mainland. I have no doubt about that, particularly if it was marketed as a Maui label, that grown by Maui farmers and crafted by Maui craftsmen, artisans. That's big with people. People want to know who their farmer is. In fact, we have t-shirts in Pennsylvania, "Who's your farmer?" Because nobody knows who their farmer is. And it's a real important issue, particularly with the food safety issues. The reason why we have people worried about what they eat is because they don't know where the food came from, who grew the food, who picked the food, how it was grown. They know nothing about their food. It has a label on it that came from a grocery store, that came from a distributor, that came from some shipping point, possibly 1,500 to 3,000 miles away. Local food represents a lot of things, not just patronizing the local economy. It's about having a relationship with the grower, giving that customer a relationship with the food, giving that customer a relationship with, for example, an environmental cause. One of the things that we also notice that if we can if we can label the food and have that label associated with stewardship practices, for example, that protect your watersheds, people would much rather buy, let's say, a quart of milk that has a label on it saying the farmers that produce this milk have agreed to implement environmental stewardship practices that protect the watershed called whatever it might be. They would rather do that than give money to, let's say, the Sierra Club, where the money goes into the general fund and it goes maybe into a lawsuit. People would rather give money to their backyard because they can relate to it. It's part of their family. It's part of their community.
What kind of programs are you familiar with that bring that sort of thing to the public's attention? Like, Who's Your Farmer? What organizations, what are the mechanics of making that happen? How could we do that here on Maui?
Well, like I said, how do we do that? How do you do something like that on Maui? How do you connect food producer with food patron, customer? Well, I think the way you do that is through organizations that, well, like Weston Price Foundation is one, Slow Food Movement is another. There's organizations that are nationwide called Buy Fresh, Buy Local. We have a chapter in my hometown. There's, again, with the PASA organization, we have the Good Food Neighborhood. All of these organizations are all about building relationships between producers and patrons. And so that can be done any way you want to do it, whatever fits. I mean, you have the Aloha spirit here, so I'm sure that what you need will surface based on the types of people that are best able to reach out and connect both powerful parties across the aisle to make this phenomena occur. I don't think it takes that much. The interest is already there. The interest on the producer side is already there. The interest on the customer side is already there. It's a matter of who's the liaison, and because producers don't have the time typically to do it, and customers, they just basically go where they're told to go, or go where they think they need to go to obtain that which they want to have. But somebody needs to kind of create the critical mass where there's an awareness that if you want to really get hooked up to a producer that has this kind of food, these are the people that are making that happen. So there could be a mercantile exchange, for example, where you can have a coalition of activities going on, events going on. It could be a space, it's physical, it could be a happening of festivals, for example. So there's a variety of ways to skin that cat, and it's not that difficult to do. You just have to have some movers and shakers that are going to be the movers and shakers.
Can you define briefly the slow food movement? What do you mean by slow food?
Well, slow food the slow food movement started in Italy by Carlo Petrini, who decided after seeing McDonald's move into Rome that he'd had enough with seeing the Italian cuisine being molested by American fast food insults. And so he started the slow food movement, it's pushing a decade now. And what it was about was, because food in Italy is cooked with preparation. There's time that goes into cooking the food. That's, relatively speaking, in terms of time, it's slow compared to McDonald's, which is quite fast. And so it's about the producers. I mean, if you look at slow food starts with the seed going in the ground. So you're actually having some reverence for the soil that supports that seed, the caring that goes into the sprout that comes out of that soil, the stewardship that's associated with that plant maturing all the way to the harvest table, and then from there going to the kitchen ultimately, where it's again revered as essentially a sacred substance that's now going to be a sacrament, a ritual, and a celebration of life called a meal. And that's what the slow food movement is all about. It's about, immersing nature into culture, and the word for that is called agriculture. Immersing history and passion and the sensory gifts that we have, the five senses that we have, and incorporating color and smell and taste, and even, you might say, even sound, because when people are eating, at least in an Italian meal, there's a lot of laughter. or maybe a lot of yelling, but there's sound. So there's sound, there's light, there's smell, there's taste, and there's touch. So the whole sensory experience of the food, you know, is part of what goes into the celebratory aspects and the ritual aspects of food from the time that it's put into the ground and harvested and prepared and ultimately celebrated. Yeah.
It's a great story. I mean, you put it very succinctly. What do you think of the state of Maui's agricultural system?
Maui agricultural system is one in peril. It's not really an agricultural system at all the way I see it. I mean, you've got the small farmers that are doing their best to produce foods that are really healthy and flavorful. But what you have here is what we have in a lot of North America, which is a commodity system which doesn't produce food. It produces a lot of calories because the Farm Bill and other subsidy programs see to it that these plantation type systems are able to produce a lot of these subsidized calories that go into a system that translates into diabetes and obesity and a whole lot of health problems. The food doesn't have nutrient density in it. What's nutrient density? Nutrient density are foods that contain optimum levels of vitamins, optimum levels of minerals, optimum levels of the right kinds of carbohydrates, the right kinds of essential fatty acids, and then all the phytochemicals that we call plant secondary metabolites, the pigments, the carotenoids, the terpenoids, all these substances that are medicinals now, we recognize as medicinals, and so that when we eat food, it's medicinal. Food is medicine. You know, Hippocrates said that how long ago? And so we know deep down scientifically, not just anecdotally, but we know scientifically that foods are profoundly medicinal. They're constantly being researched at medical research institutions. The various active compounds like resveratrol found in the grape, and lycopene found in the tomato, and lutein found in kale and an egg yolk are all profoundly medicinal in the sense that they invigorate the immune system, they downregulate inflammation, they prevent cancers and cardiovascular disease and so forth. The omega-3 fats, the omega-6 fats, the conjugated linoleic fats, these are all profoundly medicinal compounds that actually trump any medicine to correct the problem that drugs are now being administered for with great deal of risk, side effects, a great deal of expense. So our medicinal system is broken also because agriculture is broken. Really, most of our medicinal benefits should be coming from the land. And what you have here in Hawaii is not a medicinal food system. You have a plantation system that produces commodities that make people fat and make them diabetic. You know, the average consumption of sugar in the United States now today is somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 160 pounds per person per year. That's a lot of sugar that drives a lot of insulin, and insulin is a profoundly powerful hormonal substance that has a lot to do with inflammation, cardiovascular illness, and cancer. And that's why we need to start eating, we need to begin to eat foods again like we once ate, you know, a century ago, and realize that these are not foods that we're eating. They might be comfort foods or finger foods, but they're not long-lasting longevity foods. And medicinal foods happen to be the most flavorful anyway. The fun foods, the fast foods, really are kind of boring. They're bland, and that's one of the reasons why fast foods have to be laced with so much salt and so much sugar, because otherwise people would be bored out of their heads in about a week. So they go after the two primary senses in the tongue, which is salt and sugar. And so all the sugar is laced, all the foods are laced with sugar and salt, so that we're constantly addicted to those profoundly susceptible taste buds that tell us what real food in nature should taste like. That's a long answer to your question, but
I love listening to you, brother. You've got a lot of knowledge. Are you aware of the sort of, the state of Maui agriculture in the sense that we used to have a dairy here, it's gone.
Right.
You know, it went because I guess somebody could make things, milk and stuff like that, cheaper. We used to have a big egg operation in Makawao. It's gone.
Mm-hmm.
What can Maui do? What can a small community like this do to recapture that kind of agricultural industry?
Well, you got to do it differently, completely differently. You got to do it in a way that doesn't. Right. What Maui can do to bring back a defunct dairy industry, a defunct egg industry, is obviously they got to do it differently, radically differently. And the reason why they're defunct, from what I understand, the dairy industry took its first hit because of the heptachloric contamination with the pineapple waste they were feeding the dairy cows. So that basically took that milk off the market for a number of months, possibly a year if I remember correctly. And the second thing that happened was that the dairy industry, because it was geared into believing that production per cow automatically meant profitability, found out that it was importing feed, and consequently it could not produce milk affordably with the imported feeds from the mainland. And so you ended up getting a company like Meadow Gold coming in here saying, we could bring it in cheaper than you can grow it that way. The answer to that issue is to produce milk with the resources that will allow you to produce milk here very economically, which is forages, your native grasses or your not so native grasses, whatever works. And I'm not a tropical forage expert by any means, but I know that you can raise livestock like dairy animals on the forages that are now indigenous to this island, and that's where the milk production should be coming from. And don't worry about whether or not you're maximizing milk production per cow, because your cost of production is going to be incredibly insignificant compared to mainland dairy farming economics. That being said, then you want to take that raw material, that milk, and value added it into yogurt, into soft cheeses, into hard cheeses, ice creams, all this value added component of the raw milk, and that's where the profitability comes back. And you don't need huge dairy farms. Maybe the best sized dairy farm for an island like Maui is 10 or 20 cows, and maybe you need 100 of those types of operations, you know, producing all their own varieties of dairy products. This is just one possible theory. It might be better ways of doing it, but that's just one way of doing it. But I think you have to decentralize it, depend on sunshine. Your primary resource here is sunshine, and that means what you're producing is a current photosynthetic fuel. You don't want to depend on prehistoric sunlight, which is fossil fuels. You want current sunlight, and you've got a lot of that here. So it's a matter of transmuting sunlight into something that you can use right away tomorrow and run it through, whether it's chickens, pigs, beef cattle, dairy cattle, and get the finished product as low on the food chain as possible without importing hardly anything. You might have to import a couple things, but you shouldn't have to import this is not a TMR, total mixed ration kind of a dairy location. And on the mainland, what they were doing was taking the grain, grinding up the grain with the hay, with the silages, putting everything in a mechanized mix into a trough so that every bite had a little bit of everything. It's highly mechanized, and you don't have the economic feasibility to do that here. What you do have is a lot of sunlight and a lot of forages, so that could be done. The poultry industry the same way. There's no reason why you can't have a very vigorous pastured poultry operation here, which is one of the reasons why I would say we probably need to grow some cereals here instead of importing it from the mainland, because it's too expensive. You know, you need to grow small grains. You grow corn here, obviously. So there could be grain grown here on the islands that could be converted into feed for poultry. That could be egg layer, that could be meat birds, and the rest of it comes from pasture. Same with pigs. You know, some of it comes from the grains. Waste products from the dairy, like whey, could go right into the poultry and go right into the swine operations. This is being done in the Amish communities that have a diversified operation. They have a dairy farm, they're selling raw milk, and they're making artisan cheeses, and they've got a whey product left over from cheeses that goes out to the pastured pork along with some of their homegrown grains, and now they've got a pastured pork product to sell. And then they've got chickens, they've got egg layers, they've got broilers, they've got turkeys, and a lot of that's a closed loop system. They're growing some of their grain, or maybe they're buying grain from a local grower who's growing their grain for their pastured animals. So that's what you need here. And don't worry about what used to be or how to get back to that, because you can do on the mainland what's being done on the mainland. You can do that here at pastured poultry option, pastured swine option, and pastured ruminant option.
What's your experience with the politics of agriculture? Can you apply that to your experience here on Maui at all? What are the impediments to realizing the kinds of programs that you're talking about? I imagine there's some resistance among farmers who need to be brought along, but what about the general public and the political system that stands in the way of the zoning? Or
yeah, there's zoning issues. I mean, I know the land issues here I know there's a lot of land that they claim is vacant here, but you have zoning restrictions as to whether or not people can live on ag land. And I think you need to change the zoning so that if you're going to have some of this land revert back with leases or whatever it's going to be to local growers, you got to have an ability to take a lot of this land and have people occupy that land in a way that they can steward it. Otherwise, it's not going to be very effective. So the zoning issues are unique here, but the zoning issues aren't unique. Everybody's got zoning issues, and so I think you've got to go revisit that and say what's not working. What's really the low fruit on the tree that needs to be picked and changed so that you can radically change the face of agriculture to deal with a new agriculture. And that means land use, land access, water use, water access. And then there's the food safety issues. That's a big issue because there's this assumption that all food is intrinsically dangerous unless it goes through some kind of radioactive device to pasteurize it, to ionize it, whatever. And the joke of it is that there's a lot of issues with that because all of the food safety problems are originating from this highly industrialized, highly centralized food system. It's not coming from the decentralized producers. And so they have one glove fits all, one shoe fits all policies where, okay, we're not going to worry about whether or not that guy might be a safer operation than this big operation. We're going to assume every food is under suspicion because of the peanut butter issues and the spinach issues and the meat issues, the recalls. If you look at where did those food poisonings and contaminations come from, they didn't come from a small mom and pop operation. They came from a highly centralized operation that does need the kind of oversight that they're talking about. But they can't implement that same kind of regulatory oversight on small producers because it's completely unaffordable. And so they've got to be realistic about what can be done. Like in Pennsylvania, we have certified raw milk allowed by the state. It's permitted by the state. So those producers have to produce samples and they have to meet, purity standards. And occasionally somebody has a positive for a bacterium that's considered a pathogen, and that milk is taken off the market until the tests show otherwise. Interestingly enough, very, very few people ever got sick from any of those producers, even though the positive showed up. And I think the reason for that is because there's checks and balances in food. I mean, every time you take a bite of food, it contains nutrients. It also contains toxins. That's a given. And it's loaded with all kinds of microflora that you're ingesting all the time. It's a matter of whether or not the concentration of the contamination is beyond a threshold that your system can handle. And that's not being reconciled in the discussion. That's not in the discussion because basically you have the Food and Drug Administration running the whole show, and to them, all food is dangerous potentially. Therefore, all food gets treated the same. So the even playing field is quite uneven when it comes to regulating food safety, and that's the challenge, and that's where a lot of the argument and a lot of the legal battles are going to be, and a lot of the resistance is going to be, because the local food producers are the ones that have the safest, healthiest food by virtue of the record. And you could even test the food, you'll find out. I mean, Joel Salatin's an example where he does outside chicken processing right on his own farm. And they were saying, well, you need this very expensive facility to process these chickens. And he actually proved to them, based on tissue samples from his meat birds processed under a roof outside versus meat samples that came from chickens processed in a USDA inspected facility, that the bacterial counts were logarithmically, exponentially much higher in the approved facility. So just because it's inspected and passes the USDA seal doesn't make it a safer source of food. So those are a couple of the issues that I think are going to be coming up in this whole food fight pinnacle that we're facing. And I think it's going to be a food fight. I really do. We're already there.
Are we losing, how do we get back to the ability to eat right? You know, if we're so afraid of raw food that we can't get by without processing it, or having it come out of a factory. I mean, is this a matter of just public consciousness, or
yeah, I think it's
industry money that's keeping the status quo going the way it is?
Well, I think for one thing, to answer your question about how do we get into a healthy food consciousness, I think is what you're asking, and I think that is happening. I think the fact that the books that have been written that made New York Times bestseller lists, like Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food, both by Michael Pollan, the movies like Food, Inc., which made the Academy Award nomination list, that says a lot about the fact that the consciousness about food is increasing, and that the healthiness of food, the awareness that food and health are related, is increasing. So I think it's a matter of educating people, and I think there's a number of organizations, institutions, and initiatives that are doing that, whether they be journalists, whether they be film people, whether they be organizations like PASA, or the organizations that you have here on Hawaii, Weston A. Price, and on and on and on. There's a great deal of interest, I think, with the baby boom generation, which I'm a part of. We're the largest sector of the population percentage-wise. I think we constitute, kids that were born between 1946 and 1964. There's like 80 million of us. So, and we're all becoming gray. And we're aware of the fact that, the generation following us may be the first generation that's not going to live longer than we are, and that's our children and our grandchildren. So we're aware of the fact that, we're knocking on the elder door here, and we don't want to end up with these degenerative illnesses that are totally preventable. If you're talking about the United States health issues, we're talking about, $2.5 trillion in our healthcare expenditures. And 75% of that bill is totally preventable in terms of preventable illnesses. If you take out smoking and alcohol, which is part of that, you're down to probably $1.5 trillion of health issues that are related to what we eat and what we don't eat. That's how significant it is. So we spend more than any other nation on the face of the earth for health care, and we have some of the worst health care consequences as a result of that policy. So I think the government's starting to realize that we can't keep going on. We have a diabetes epidemic. We have an obesity epidemic. Those are incredibly crucial because diabetes is the #1 cause of stroke. It's the #1 cause of lower limb amputation. It's the #1 cause of blindness, and it's the #1 cause of kidney dialysis, all of which are massively expensive. And those are food issues. Those are agricultural issues. Because when you say food, it's agriculture. So the solution to the healthcare debacle that we have here is agriculture. That's the solution to the healthcare debacle that we have, is getting a holistic agriculture back in place. Because diabetes is just one thing. We're talking now, today, 40% of the American population is overweight and 20% is obese. In another 10 years, it's going to be possibly 65 to 75% of the population overweight and 40% of us obese. This is a massive, massive problem. So cancer is an epidemic. 40% of Americans get cancer now, or will get cancer. 20% of Americans will die of cancer. And cancer is an extremely costly illness to have because it's profoundly chronic and it's profoundly mostly incurable. We still haven't cured cancer. I mean, non-aggressive cancers they've been able to contain to some extent, but the big four cancer killers, which are colorectal cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, and breast cancer, once those illnesses have metastasized, there's been virtually no improvement since Nixon declared war on cancer, and we spent $200 billion on pharmaceutical research to cure cancer. Virtually no progress on metastatic illness on the four big killers. So we obviously have to prevent cancer. And you can't prevent cancer without taking care of your food system, and that means you got to have an agriculture that produces food. That's really food.
You're one smart bugger. So what do you hope would come out of this Maui Agricultural Design Conference? What benefit might accrue to Maui from this activity?
Well, I think, I mean, for what I've seen in the sessions that I've sat in on, I think the economic piece is the big piece. Because what we really need are people that are on the land, and they've got to be profitable. And that's an entrepreneurial ethic. So we have to have an entrepreneurial thrust so that, you know, there are incubators so that they can get the advice, they can get the lending, they can get the mentoring, they can get the markets. All of that needs to come together in a coalition of resources of people and investors and philanthropists and government agencies and the local policymakers have to eventually come around and realize that this is a huge opportunity to make Maui both environmentally much healthier, economically vibrant. It could be a place where you don't have to worry about all the things you're currently struggling with that are based on agriculture and environment and economy are all in the same basket. Those funds, if you look at the multiplier effect of agriculture, you know, every dollar that's generated on the farm generates $7 more in the economy. That's assuming there's no value-added component. Now take that product that came off the farm and do something with it. Let's say take the milk and turn it into yogurt. You know, by the time you factor in all the multipliers that are associated with these enterprises, you've got a 20x effect. Now, if you want to talk about resurrecting an economy, that's the best way to resurrect an economy. Because food is the only thing that everybody purchases every day. They don't buy cell phones every day. They don't buy automobiles every day. As important as those industries might be and the jobs they create, nothing trumps the agricultural industry. The problem we have in agriculture is we're not paying our fair share for the food. And one of the reasons why is because, for number one, the majority of what's being grown on the land mass in the United States isn't food. These are commodities that have to be highly processed to be run through feedlot cattle or whatever it might be, or ethanol plants. And secondly, the people that are producing the fruits, the vegetables, and the other value-added things I talked about earlier are not seeing the light of day because they're being marginalized. The Farm Bill doesn't support those people. The Farm Bill supports the commodity people. And that tells you that it's a highly politicized system because there's no reason why we should be subsidizing the entire continent of North America to grow maize, GMO maize and GMO soybeans to run through feedlots, and in the meantime we marginalize people that are producing nutrient-dense fruits, vegetables, and other animal proteins and animal fats that are highly medicinal and necessary. They're requisite for healthy families. And that would be part of a decentralized farming system that would immensely generate a local economy that would create a vibrant rural America again. That's what we have. We've emptied the countryside. We need 50 million farmers. That's what I think. You know, that's not to say we have to get rid of large farms. That's fine. We have large farms, but we need a lot of smallholders producing food that's going to be available to their neighbors. And that means you have to have coalitions and you have to have incubators and all those things that I just mentioned. And if you have those things, you're going to have an extremely vibrant economy because right now, the average farmer, by the time he sells his commodity, is netting about 5% of what, of what the gross is, which is nothing. Whereas if we've got the farmers that are generating foods that ultimately end up in the community, they're going to end up with 3/4 of that dollar that's ultimately ending up there. And that generates more money to him. And farmers, when they get money, they spend money. So you're basically, what you're doing is you're monetizing your raw materials, which means that the best honest economy you can have is a solar-based economy. And agriculture is a solar-based economy because sunlight's given to you every day as a new resource that you didn't have to pay for. There is no resources without sunlight. So that 95% of every plant that you're looking at here is made up of free resources: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. 5% comes out of the soil. So you don't even have to provide the 5% because that soil you have might already have 3% out of that 5% already there. So you're talking about a very good return on your investment when you have to provide just a small percentage of what that total plant biomass consists of. The rest of it's free through sunlight. Now that's an economy. And then that gets monetized. This raw material now goes through the human hands and the value-added hands, and by the time it comes through the whole system, it's generated abundant wealth without all of this fictitious, dishonest, and faux pas kinds of shenanigans that are going on in our economic system, because we don't have an economic system. I mean, that's not an economy. I mean, when you can take figments, chop them up, and then sell them as other figments, and then get people sucked in, assuming that they've got their earnings, their hard work invested in something of value when there's nothing there, well, it's obviously a sham. And it's obviously being manipulated by those who know how to manipulate that sham. So we have an economic system that's broken, we have a medical system that's broken, we have an agricultural system that's broken, we have an educational system that's broken. So all these things have really crumbled because we centralized and industrialized everything and franchised all of our basic needs. We franchised all of our, what do we franchise? Medicine, agriculture, recreation, transportation, energy. Everything's been franchised out to corporations whose primary objective is to appease the avariciousness of their shareholders on short term. So there is no long-term planning, where people who are on the land are thinking downstream. Anyway, I gave you about 500 times more than you're going to be able to use, so all this is going to be sliced and diced out of it.
Fascinating, though. I mean, this is a movie in and of itself, you know. Do you do TV shows? Do you do TV programs?
I've done not really TV programs. I've done, DVDs and things like that.
Are they in distribution?
Yeah, there's a couple. Acres USA has done 3 DVDs. One's on, keynotes of animal health, cancer, nutrition, and healing. Another one working with a veterinarian on how to deal holistically with sick animals. So there was those 3 DVDs I did. And there's other DVDs from Australia where I've given lectures at the, the Woodford Folk Festival in near Brisbane, which is a big annual festival between Christmas and New Year's. And it's a permaculture property of like 500 or 600 acres, and they raise funds to keep this permaculture institute going with this huge week-long arts and music festival. Well, one of the components there is a thing called Radiance. And it's all about alternative health, alternative energy, alternative agriculture. And so I've spoken at that a couple of times. And they've done videos of that. I haven't even seen the videos, but I know they have them. So there's been a thing called the 3 Up Tour. I traveled around Australia with 2 other guys for about a month. And we gave lectures all over the country. And so all that was videotaped. And of course, I haven't seen those either. I mean, I could if I wanted to. I just haven't taken the time to say, hey, the last person I'm going to look at the end of the day is me. I really don't have any interest in time to watch myself speak again, so.
I hear you. So last question, how do you feel about this Ag Conference here?
I think it's a fantastic start. I really think it's something that you really need here. I think it's something that
Ag Conference in response. I
sure.
think this Maui Ag Design.
I think this Maui Ag Design Conference is long overdue, a long time coming. I think is something that really is going to be lasting. I mean, I think in the past, when people have conferences, people come to the conferences and then they go home and it's life as usual, business as usual. I think what I've seen here is a very, very strong interest in wanting to say, okay, let's implement things now. And what can we implement? I think what we're seeing here is not just what are the problems, what are the solutions, but dialing in the details of when do we get started and how do we get started and what can we implement right now and what can we implement a little later on and what's our vision downstream. So you've got it from start to finish. So I really think it's got some great opportunities because you have people here that expressively said that they want to be committed to keeping this thing very much alive and well. So I think it's fantastic. I think you've landed, let's put it that way. I think you really have landed here. And this is what you need. The conferences are great, but you need an incubator of good minds, a vision, a plan. You need a strategy. You need a plan and a strategy as to how to implement that plan. And what you have here is a strategy to do so. And I think you will see things come of this in short order. And I think you have great things to come in moderate to long term, for sure. So it's a great idea, and I think you're going to be very happy that this thing started and it won't end. Because I've seen this in other areas. I've seen this in other areas in our neck of the woods. Things that started as just this kind of an approach 20 years ago are now really influencing agriculture and the communities that they want it to influence. And timing is everything. So your timing couldn't be more appropriate. Right now, you're in peril here on this island. You got a lot of issues, like we all do, but you got to do something soon. And you're the guys with the best ideas, for sure. So carry on.
Perfect. Okay.